We're going to begin with a prayer, and then I will introduce Joanna Williams. This prayer is Strangers in a Foreign Land. Lord God, help us to remember those who tonight will go to sleep unfed and unwelcome, strangers in foreign lands, people who have fled for their lives and are far from their homes. We lift up to you those who are escaping persecution and conflict, having fled death, torture, or ruthless exploitation. So many carry wounds, mental and physical. So many have suffered greatly. Lord Jesus, give us more of your compassion for their plight. Soften our hearts to their situation, and help us to follow your lead in seeking justice and mercy on their behalf. We pray for an end to war, poverty, and human rights abuses that drive desperate people to become refugees in the first place. We give thanks for people working in troubled countries and ask for more of your blessing so we can bring life, dignity, and hope to those who remain. We thank you that you are Lord of all the earth and all its people are loved by you. We pray these things in the name of your Son, who was himself born into the troubled life of a refugee. Amen. So now I have the privilege of introducing Joanna Williams. Joanna has served at the Kino Border Initiative since 2015. She was named the Executive Director in March 2021, and before that, Joanna worked as the Director of Education and Advocacy for 6 years. In that role, she launched and managed an innovative transnational legal partnership with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project. And she coordinated the advocacy work of the Jesuit Migration Network of Central America and North America. Joanna graduated with a bachelor's in science from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where she was named as a Truman Scholar. She received a master's in public policy from Arizona State University and was recognized as the outstanding graduate of the School of Public Affairs. In 2013, she conducted Fulbright research on the reintegration of deported and returned migrants, which has since been published in Emigración, Tránsito y Retorno en México and Procesos Migratorios en México, Nuestros Rostros, Mismas Dinámicas. Joanna, we're delighted to have you with us this evening. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sister Katie, for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be celebrating my 1-year anniversary as Executive Director with you all, and to just have the chance to share a little bit about the work of the Kino Border Initiative. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Kino Border Initiative is a binational organization. We're a Catholic organization that partners with the Jesuits and the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist, as well as other lay and religious collaborators. And what we seek is to promote humane, just, and workable migration here at the US-Mexico border. So what that means is really 3 main dimensions of our work. And I think, and I'll show some photos here of our center. I think it's so perfect. I didn't even choose the name Hand in Hand for this presentation, but it really speaks to the spirit of KBI. So we actually have all over our building. I don't know if you can see on this slide over to the right, we have the Hand in Hand. On the front of our building, we also have the Hand in Hand. But it's because the first dimension of our work we call holistic accompaniment. So we talk more about accompaniment probably than service, because accompaniment is about being hand in hand with somebody on a journey. And that means a lot of services that we provide. So we served almost 200,000 meals last year. We gave clothing to over 10,000 people. 2,500 people saw our social worker. Over 2,500 people got medical services. So there's a lot of services that are involved in that accompaniment. But our idea of accompaniment goes beyond just services. And I think a good example of this is from last month when I was sitting and chatting with a man who was waiting outside of our aid center. His name is Rolando. And he had come up from Guanajuato. He was actually, at one time of his life, pretty well off. He was a restaurant owner in the state of Guanajuato, which is in central Mexico. He had even come up to the Nogales area years ago for vacation to go to the beach around here. And now he was coming up because he was obligated to. So he came up to Guanajuato. He was in Guanajuato, and then the cartels took over the area of the state that he was in, and started to threaten him and say, if you don't pay us this certain amount every month, then we're going to come after you. And then that amount just kept going up and up and up until he couldn't afford it anymore. And they came and they kidnapped him and tortured him, and basically left him for dead. And so he abandoned his restaurant, he abandoned his business, all that he had, and came up to the border. And came to Kino, yes, for the very immediate needs. He came to Kino to have a meal to eat. He came to the Kino for medical care for his wounds that he was still carrying from when he was tortured. But then he's become part of this Kino accompaniment in a longer term sense. So he's been here for about 7 months. And he started to see our psychologist for psychological care to process, what his experience was. We helped him find a job. He's now a cook. He's not a restaurant owner anymore, but he cooks in a commercial kitchen here for the factories in the area. And we helped him place him as well in housing. We connected him with an apartment that he could rent. And now he says that he's the one that calls us and will say, oh, I have an open space in my apartment. This is a good place to live. Make sure to recommend it to any migrants who you know of who need a place to live. So he's not just somebody who's receiving from Kino, but he's become part of that community of accompaniment that we try to promote, where he's excited about welcoming other people or helping other people integrate into the town while they're stranded in this middle ground. So that's the first dimension of our work, is this holistic accompaniment. The photo that you see, I guess I should have started with that. The photo that you see is of our dining area, and then back behind those big murals to the left is our shelter area. So we have capacity in our shelter right now for 60 people. We've been increasing it as COVID has gone on the decline. We've been able to increase that shelter capacity a little more. One day we're hoping to be able to reach the total, the number of beds, which is 120. But right now we're at 50% capacity in the shelter. And so it's really important for us to walk alongside people in this holistic accompaniment. But that's only one of the dimensions of our work, because if that's where we left it, then Rolando would be stranded in Nogales forever. There would be more and more people like Rolando who arrive to us. And our goal is actually not to have a beautiful center. Our goal is to not exist as an organization. And in order to do that, we have to engage in education and advocacy, which are the other two dimensions of our work. So our education work is really focused on making sure that people in the US and in Mexico can hear directly from migrants and can have migrants' experiences touch their own hearts and animate them towards solidarity. So a lot of the education work that we do is welcoming down immersion groups who will visit. Sister Katie led an immersion group of Mandalayan seminarians who came and visited and met the migrants and heard from them. But we also do other kinds of education groups, education work. So Sister Engracia, who's here on our staff, actually wrote a book of testimonies of migrants. It's called Voices of the Border. That's the picture that's up there. With this idea of if immersions of coming and visiting at Nogales is so powerful for students, but not all students can come down here. Can I reach them through this book? Can the testimonies, if these testimonies that have touched me and have touched so many really do have a transformative impact, then maybe we can get a better reach through publishing them. So that's what Engracia did in her book that was published last year, which is our second dimension of work, is education. And then our third dimension of work is advocacy. which is trying to change policy in the US and in Mexico. So promote more humane, just, and workable policy. And it's interesting, you know, I name the dimensions almost in order because it's also the order that migrants experience them at our center. So I think of a woman, Maria del Rosario, who was from central Mexico, had also with her family in last year. And she came to Kino, first of all, because she had some really basic needs. She needed food, she needed clothing for her kids. And then she started to see the marches that we put together. So this is a picture of a march that was led by the children migrants about what it's like to be a child waiting for asylum or protection in the US. She participated in one for the World Day of Refugees and Migrants, in which the bishop came, and there were 600 people who gathered for this march and vigil. But she was always off on the side. She was always, you know, kind of in the background, looking at what other people were doing, never quite confident in her own voice. Until then, one of the other migrants who's involved in our advocacy work invited her in and said, well, how about you just come to a meeting with us and learn a little bit more about how we organize these events. And she started to participate in meetings, and she started to do educational presentations. She did a virtual presentation for 40 people about her experience of migration and her experience as a migrant leader now in the community. And this Monday, she's going to be the MC of our Stations of the Cross to commemorate the 2-year anniversary of Title 42, which I'll explain what that is in a little bit. But she has grown in such confidence in her own voice and the power of her advocacy as she seeks a better life for her and for her kids. And so it's powerful for us to watch her transform from this moment of coming to Kino because she has immediate needs to really now participating with Kino and trying to change the world, trying to change the way that we approach migration. And so that's why it's so important for us to work in each of those 3 dimensions, hand in hand, as the invitation so beautifully, or the title of the event so beautifully put it. And so that's a little bit about the work of Kino. I've already started to tell lots of stories because that's the only way that I can explain the work here. But I do want to back up a moment and just give a little deeper sense of why is it that people are arriving here to the Kino Border Initiative. And I think ultimately, you know, the reason that people are leaving their countries is seeking lives and seeking livelihoods. And I differentiate those 2 because we oftentimes talk about 2 major factors of migration. One is being poverty, and one is violence. So people who are fleeing persecution in their communities. So about 70% of the people that we receive in Nogales say that persecution or violence is their main reason for migration. So seeking basic safety. And then about 30% say that economic reasons is their main reason for migration. I think we should be careful about making too clear of a distinction between those 2. Because the reality is that those are oftentimes intertwined. And I think of a woman named Antonia, who is from Guatemala, and she worked in a farm in Guatemala, really more of a ranch land. And the farm paid her so little that 50% of what she was earning was just going to the transportation to get to her work. So off the top, half of what she earns in a given week is already disappeared because of transportation. And then that what little is left, she has to make work for food and for lodging and, you know, all of the other expenses that she had for her and for her family. And then she lost her job. Then she was fired from the job in the granja, in the farmland, and had to find an alternative way to make money. So she ended up taking over a friend's food business, selling food, preparing food and selling that. But that's a business that's more exposed to organized crime. So they wanted to get a cut of her earnings, and they would threaten her, much like Rolando mentioned, like when I was talking about Rolando, that they would extort her and then say, if you didn't pay this, then we'll attack you. And then her daughter ended up actually escaping from a kidnapping attempt. So it was that combination for Antonia of having that economic difficulty over the course of many years, trying to find different strategies, and then finding that the strategies to make money were also the strategies that would expose her more to organized crime, that motivated her and her daughter to come up here to Nogales. And I mentioned her story, and I think in general, when we think about people who are fleeing because of their lives and livelihoods, it is for their own protection. But the reason I put the photos of kids here isn't just because, you know, the kids are cute or they're compelling, but really it's parents making decisions to try to figure out what is best for my children. So in the case of Antonia, maybe I could survive here, maybe I could make the food business work, but if my daughter is also going to be kidnapped, then that was, for her, was the breaking point. After all these different attempts she'd made to try to stay in Guatemala, that was a breaking point where she said, no, I need to come up to Nogales. So it's oftentimes something related to kids and to their experience as parents that motivates migrants to come up to the border. So what do they find then? They fled Guatemala, they fled central Mexico, like Rolando, like Antonia, and they come up and they encounter a wall, literally and metaphorically. So for people who are fleeing violence from Mexico or Central America or really anywhere else, there is no access to protection in the US right now. So somebody can't walk up to the port of entry, they can't go up, turn themselves into migration officials and say, I'm afraid I need to go enter a legal process. Because the US has an order that's called Title 42 that used the pandemic as a pretext to take away the right to asylum. So when somebody walks up to the port of entry, the officials say, no, we can't process you right now. Or if they try to cross the desert, then the officials will send them immediately back to Nogales, Sonora. So this order, Title 42, has been in place now for 2 years. That's why I mentioned the event this Monday, the Way of the Cross, commemorating the 2-year anniversary. It was put in place 2 years ago, and every month the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has to renew the order. And next week is a week in which they're going to have to decide whether or not to renew Title 42, which is why we have a lot of our advocacy focus there right now. It was interesting, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I will say that there have been some court challenges against Title 42. And I was reading one of the judge's decisions that was kind of questioning, the judge didn't decide completely against this policy, but he did question, he said, it's interesting to me that this is a public health order, but not a single public health official has supported any evidence in support of the order. So that's why I talk about how it uses the pandemic as a pretext and then creates more suffering for people in Nogales, because people like Rolando and people like Antonia now don't have access to any kind of legal channel. And when people don't have access to a legal channel, the only alternative that they see is to try to cross through the desert, which is the way that border security is designed here on the US-Mexico border, is to try to drive people into more and more rural areas if they are going to try to cross the desert. And that increases their risk of dying in the desert. So we've had over 7,000 people die along the desert, and probably many more than that. That's probably an undercount of how many people in the last 2 decades have died while trying to cross into the US. This is a picture on the right, is a picture of one of the crosses that marks a spot where someone had died. And we oftentimes come across families who are looking for their loved ones who they haven't heard from since they came in and tried to go across the desert. And I remember one time having to tell a mom and her 4-year-old, she was looking for her husband who had crossed, and we looked up in the jails, you know, is there any chance that he's detained anywhere in the US? And when we couldn't find him anywhere, I had to tell the mom, I said, I think that you need to talk to the medical examiner and see if there's any chance that they have his body. And so our policy uses, this is why I use the word deterrence, the US government has chosen to use death as a tool of immigration enforcement. Because then the idea is, well, then maybe people won't cross the border, but people keep crossing the border and they keep dying and they keep suffering out in the desert. Like a woman named Vilma, she came to us just a couple of months ago, and she had been out in the desert for 5 days, had run out of food and water and passed out. And then her group that she was with, because people usually have a smuggler and they have other migrants they're traveling with. The group that she was with abandoned her when she passed out. They continued their journey. She came to and realized that she was all alone in this vast expanse, that she didn't know where she was. And it wasn't for another day and a half until Border Patrol finally found her and then detained her and then deported her back to Nogales, Mexico. So she was quite literally on the brink of dying. She was really severely dehydrated when she came to us. And this wasn't in the summer, this was in late December, early January. And once we get into the summer months, that dehydration and other suffering increases. But it's not that people don't know per se the risks of being in the desert. They don't cross because they're naive. They cross because they don't see an alternative, because risking death in the desert for some people is better than risking death while at home. And that's kind of the terrible calculus that people are forced into here. So I, kind of against this context, the teaser for this event, or the announcement for this event, promised to talk about the joys and the challenges. And I think it's important that even when we talk about the deep suffering that migrants experience, the way that our policies are unjust, the reality is that people are more than their migration experience. And so it's really important for us in that context of holistic accompaniment to create spaces for people to exist outside of just being migrants, spaces for celebration, spaces for community. The photo of this little girl is on the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, or All Souls Day, the day after All Souls Day. And it's really, it's important in the Catholic Church in general, but it's very important in Mexico, Dia de los Muertos, as a time, yes, to commemorate the dead, yes, mourn the dead, but just as importantly, a time to celebrate the eternal life, a time to celebrate family and community. And so we had a chance to do that. We put up an altar to the dead in our center, and people were able to bring photos of their different relatives and put them up on the altar. So it's, again, creating that moment of community in the midst of the challenging journey. And then the photo on the right is a photo of a mom and her baby. The baby was actually born while he was, not in the shelter, in the sense that the mom was staying in the shelter and then we brought her to the hospital. But he was born while his mom was living in the shelter. His mom is from Honduras, and she really wanted to get her little baby baptized. So we worked with a parish priest for her to go through the baptism classes and then go through his baptism. So this is a picture of the party after the baptism. But this was a really special moment for me. Just after this picture was taken, I was standing with a woman who I'll call Joanna, who is from an indigenous area in southern Mexico. And she had suffered really extreme domestic violence pretty much her entire life. Really hadn't, both from her family of origin and then from the man that she was forced to marry, had always been mistreated and always disrespected and physically abused. And then she fled and was up in our shelter at the time of this baptism. And I was talking to her, and she said, I can't believe that I was invited to a party. I've never gone to a party in my whole life. It's so cool to be at a party. I didn't even know what parties were. And so it's so special for me to stand with Juana and just enjoy the party of the cake and the dancing and all that we were able to do with the mom and the baby. But know that this was for more than just this mom and her little baby. It was really for all of the people in the shelter, to have a moment of joy and celebration in what has been difficult journeys like that one that Juana has had. So I think that's an encouragement that I would give to you. I think if we just think about the suffering, it's easy to feel desperate about the situation at the border. But when we can weave together suffering and joy and realize that people are more than their migration experiences, then that's what gives us the energy to make a difference. It's what gives us the energy to work towards a better world. A world in which Kino Border Initiative doesn't have to exist, because people aren't either forced to migrate, or when they do migrate, they're not forced to be in such dangerous and deadly conditions. Which, speaking of, I can't tell Juana's story without telling the end of it. She arrived here in September of last year, and has been many months in Nogales. When she arrived, the border was closed, as I mentioned. But her case in and of itself is really extraordinary. So when she first came in, she met Sister Ingracia, who I mentioned earlier. She was the one who wrote the book. And Sister Ingracia told her, I'm going to do everything I can in my power to try to help you access the asylum process in the US. And when Sister Ingracia told me that, I said, oh my goodness, like this is another time that Ingracia she believes in justice in the world, and she has this vision of the future. And I just don't think it's possible. You know, everything that around me is telling me that this is not going to happen. I think Ingracia is using a lot of time and energy, and it's not going to bear fruit. And she would call all these indigenous rights activists because of the Juana's indigenous, so trying to get their support and take notes on all of the case and build up this case file. And then our legal team with Florence Project, we partner with the Florence Project to provide legal services to people in the US, and they put together a humanitarian parole application for Juana. But we've filed, I think, 30 humanitarian parole applications, and almost all of them have been denied or not even answered to. They didn't answer them for months and months and months, and then they started denying it. So I even didn't see that as a hope. And I said, oh, Ingracia, why are you working so hard on something that won't bear fruit? Well, a couple of days ago, we got the news that the Customs and Border Protection was going to make an exception for Juana and for her 2 daughters. And the 3 of them presented for asylum in the US yesterday morning, and are now, I think they're actually probably in a shelter in Tucson right now. I need to give my staff a call to figure out where they are at the moment. But for me, it was a testament to the power of that perseverance in the midst of, policies that don't give any way forward, when, are meant to make us more hopeless. But Sister Ingracia believes so strongly in her calling and in God's invitation to be present to Juana that after many, many months, it really did bear fruit. So it's probably not the last time in my life that I'm not going to believe that when Sister Ingracia tells me she's going to do something, but I hope that she keeps proving me wrong, because I also didn't think that she would ever publish a book, and here we are with her book. So I really should have learned my lesson, and I haven't. But I'm grateful that she continues to amaze me by her vision and her journey. I wanted to share briefly, kind of along that line of what someone like Ingracia, Sister Ingracia can do, what we can do, but also the way that you all can be involved in our work. So obviously it's, our work is only possible because of financial support. We're really grateful for the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration for the extraordinary support to our social work and to our legal work that allow us to reach people like Rolando and Antonia and Juana. You can also be involved in our advocacy efforts. So I really encourage you to take a time. The Way of the Cross on Monday is going to be from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. our time, which I think is 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. your time. So if you have a little bit of time there, we'd really appreciate if you can pray with us. Pray at the Way of the Cross. I'll put a video link into the chat in a little bit that you could join us via live transmission for the event. But in some way be in solidarity with us. Like I said, this next week is a really critical week to see if this order that ends access to asylum will continue in April or not. So this is a good time to contact your senators and let them know what your thoughts are on that. Or write a letter to the editor, say, I heard this presentation and I heard about this march on Monday, and this is my opinion. So I think that oftentimes people who are far from the border, your senators and your communities don't feel connected to the realities here. And you can be that connective tissue that says what happens in Nogales matters to us, because this is our country, because these are our decisions, and because these are families who are connected to families in our area. They're the sister or the daughter or the cousin of immigrants in your own communities. You can also continue to learn more, and I just teased you with a few testimonies, a few people that I've met in the last couple of months. But if you buy Sister Ingracia's book, Voices of the Border, you'll see more there. And you're also welcome to volunteer at KBI. We have a special volunteer program actually for women religious, in which we can pay your plane ticket and your housing. And it's really designed more as an advocacy program. So it's to come and volunteer, but also to be trained in our advocacy work and in migration policy so that you can be more effective as you go back to your communities. So at the end of the presentation, I'll put up a flyer about that. But just so those of you who are women religious on the call know that you have that opportunity. So I'll stop my share so that I can see you all. But that's a little bit about KBI and about the experiences at the border. I'd be really interested. I forgot to say that you could ask questions while I was going, but now that you are now that you're well into the presentation, I would love to hear what questions you have, which I think you can put in the chat, or you can wave your hand and I can call on you, whatever feels most easiest for you.
I was just reading the other day that President Biden had signed some legislation that would allow children who are alone to come across the border. Are you finding now that you're receiving more single children than you were before?
That's a good question. And it's just to kind of clarify what happened is that the Title 42, which I mentioned, that stopped people from seeking asylum, when President Biden came into office, he made an exception for unaccompanied minors. So he said this order won't apply to unaccompanied minors. But a court last week said that the way that he made that exception wasn't appropriate. So that's why this more recent news of him, it was basically him changing the way that he could make the exception. And I think, so I don't think that order this week has had a direct effect on us, but certainly in a broader sense, it's a really difficult decision that families have to make, because a family as a whole can't seek asylum in the US. But if they send their kid by themselves, then that kid could seek asylum in the US. And I don't know what I would do as a mom in that situation. You know, when I know that my 12-year-old or my 10-year-old is in danger here and could be safe, but that would mean being separated from me. There's not a right answer to that, but we certainly have parents and families that are struggling with that, of how to what to do in the face of this this unjust system where families can't be safe, but minors all by themselves can be safe. It doesn't make sense. I have a couple of other questions here in the chat. So someone was asking about people from Afghanistan and what's happening with them. We haven't had any Afghanis here in Nogales. We really don't get a lot of people from, we don't get as much diversity of nationalities. So we did get 20 people from 20 different nationalities last year, which was the most we've ever seen. But it's pretty rare for us to receive anybody who's not Central American or not Mexican or not Venezuelan. Mostly because we aren't close to a major airport in Mexico. So the closest airport is 3.5 hours south. And for people who are flying in from other places, it makes more sense for them to go to a place like Tijuana. So that's why a place like Tijuana sees a lot more diversity in nationalities. And then it kind of has this domino effect, or it creates a cycle where then if somebody's coming from a country like Afghanistan or Ukraine or Russia or wherever it is, they know somebody who went to Tijuana and not somebody who went to Nogales. So it's possible. So usually we only receive people in that situation when there's problems in other cities along the border and someone's already tried to go there and then comes to Nogales. But it's one of the reasons that we mostly see Central Americans and Mexicans. And then I have a question from Sister Teresa, which I love your name, by the way, and that's my daughter's name, and to ask if I could speak to the situation of safety and community services. So Nogales is one of the safer cities along the border, but safety is relative. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So it's a very safe city for people like myself, because organized crime has no interest in going against somebody from the US. They're very much on a business mentality. That would be bad for business. And there's a lot of people in Nogales who wouldn't notice the danger or the control of organized crime in the city. But what organized crime does do is they go after the people who are most vulnerable, the people they think they're best positioned to take advantage of, and that would be the migrants. So it's extraordinarily common for people to be stopped and robbed on the streets. I was talking to a mom the other day that her 2 kids were playing outside of the little house, the little apartment they were renting basically, and 2 men showed up in ski masks with guns and just barged their way into the apartment, didn't say anything. They were clearly looking for someone that they didn't find, and then they just left. So it's almost a normalization of that kind of insecurity. It would be so shocking for us here in the US to have men in ski masks and guns just barge into our house. And yet in Nogales, it's part of what migrants have to struggle with on a daily basis. In terms of, and so that's why I think that so many people like try to integrate here in Nogales. We try to help them find jobs and housing and make a life here, but their horizon is often still on the US because they say, I just can't feel safe here in Nogales. Yes, it's a little bit safer maybe than where I'm from, but it's not a safe city for me to be in. So that's some of the tension of how much do we want to, we work to support people to integrate here, but are the conditions really in place here for them to feel at home? And then in terms of community services, I think probably referring to like other places that they can get assistance. There are other services in Nogales to a certain extent, but what's the best way to say it? So there's some government services like food banks that some migrants will access, especially if they end up renting further away from Nogales, they'll go to those other places or further away than from the Kino Border Initiative. They might go to those other places to get access to food and other kinds of services. There's not much of an infrastructure around social support in the city, especially for people who are migrants. So most of the different supports require you to be local. You have to have a local address. You have to have a local bill, a local gas bill, that shows that you've been living here for a while. You certainly have to have Mexican documentation. You can't be from Central America. So people get excluded from a lot of services, including school. A lot of the schools won't admit kids that aren't Mexican, even though in Mexican law, they can't be discriminated against for that reason, for not having the documentation. So yes, there are some community services, but it's pretty hard for migrants to access them. And then I have a question about LULAC in Denison, Iowa, in a legal assistance fund program. Do we have any resources or guidance? Well, you all probably know your local area more than we do. I think it's a really needed initiative to increase legal assistance. It's actually something that the migrants, so some of the people who, when the border was more open and when people were able to seek asylum in the US, some of the migrants that were in Nogales entered the US, and so we've had follow-up video calls with them. And it's the one thing that they keep going back to is it's so hard to find legal assistance. We can't find a lawyer that we can afford, and it makes sense that lawyers do need to charge for their time. For as well-hearted, as big-hearted as they are, if they don't work for a nonprofit, they do need to make money in some way. And at the same time, that those fees are inaccessible for migrants. So I think it's really critical, this proposal of LULAC to start a legal assistance fund program. There's a sort of a larger philosophical question for these kinds of programs, and there's some good models in New York did a universal representation program. There's a couple of other models. There's a question of, do you support people only who have really strong cases, who have a really strong chance of getting legal assistance, and invest your funds more there? Or do you invest it a little bit more broadly because everybody has the right to a fair day in court and everyone has the right to legal representation and assistance? I can't resolve that philosophical question for you. I can say that we lean a little bit more towards the second, which is everyone should get quality information, everyone should get assistance, and then whether their case is strong enough is something that the court itself will work out. but there's strong arguments for this first one. So I guess the only guidance that I gave was asking you another question to think about. And I think I have a hand up too from Eileen.
Hi, thank you so much, Joanna, for this presentation. It's so good. It's hard, hard to hear, but we're so appreciative of it. I'm really interested in hearing how you're working with the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist. Could you speak a little bit of your collaboration with them?
Sure. Well, we're not even working with them. They are one of the co-founders of the organization. So the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist existed in Nogales before Kino Border Initiative existed. They did some partnerships with Border Links around education at the border, and then they saw migrants who were being deported to Nogales and saw the need for food and for clothing. And so they started bringing burritos down to the port of entry, and they convinced the then mayor to lay a slab of concrete for them to start a little ad hoc lean-to soup kitchen, which is our humble origins. That was Sister Engracia, of course, with all her skills, convincing the mayor to pay for a slab of concrete. And now we have 4 Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist at the organization in different capacities. So one runs the shelter, one runs our food service. Sister Engracia does several things, including education and volunteer coordination. And then we have another one who's a social worker. And we had a chance, I'm glad you asked the question, because it's a question that I'm always asking, about how can we partner well with the congregation. We had a chance to do an evaluation about a year ago of our relationship and what was the benefit of it and what were some of the challenges of it so that we can better collaborate. And one of the things that came out of that is that the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist are Mexican order, so they're from the Adoratrices in Mexico. They moved to active life after Vatican II. But because they're just a Mexican order, they don't have a lot of resources. A lot of the places that they're at, people don't pay them salaries. A lot of the sisters that they recruit, the vocations that come up, don't tend to be people that have studied university. At best, they've graduated high school, but oftentimes the congregation itself will help these sisters graduate from high school. So out of that evaluation, we were able to say, well, maybe something that Kino can offer is more resources to support kind of the congregational infrastructure. So that's why we took this 4th sister in, who she's studying half-time. So she's getting a degree in social work at the university while she works with us as a social worker or in our social work department at the same time. So it felt like a way that we could help a sister in formation of the congregation to grow in skills and experience that the congregation itself might not be able to afford without Kino. And I think in turn, what we've been talking about with the congregations, a lot of their missions are in indigenous areas of Mexico. And we, as an organization, really haven't spent enough time becoming better with working with indigenous populations. A lot of our staff is Mexican, and doesn't really identify with indigenous roots. And so we don't have good language access. We don't have good cultural competency with these different groups. So we've asked the missionary sisters, can you all train us, guide us and train us and help us to be better with this, because it's something that we're failing on. So that's why one of the sisters is from an indigenous community. She speaks Zapoteco, which is a language in Oaxaca. And it's amazing what a difference that makes. I mean, just in and of itself. And I think also it's hopefully the start of a longer journey with the congregation that we can learn from them to improve our accompaniment.
Thank you. It's a beautiful example of the mutual enrichment that both of you, that the congregation and the organization can offer each other. So thanks so much.
Yeah, it's a long journey. So if any recommendation, I'm always learning. So
well, we're learning too, actually. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of interested in it, in hearing that, because we too are starting a relationship with the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist through one of our sisters, Joyce Bloom, and we're looking at how to support some of their efforts in Agua Prieta. So yeah, so it just feels like another really strong connection and a beautiful network. So
Oh, that's beautiful. We'll have to connect offline. But Sister Gracia and I were talking about another initiative, and I said, well, I think the sisters at Kino have had a lot of support. So is there something that the sisters in Agua Prieta need? And she said, oh, do they have another great partner? But I don't remember what they're called. So that must be you all.
Great. Oh, it's good to have friends all over the place.
Yeah, that is. And then there's a question in the chat too about Ukrainian refugees and how that affects, how we're reflecting on that from KBI. And well, first of all, just to clarify, because I've gotten this question, we don't have any Ukrainians who have arrived to Nogales. But I think I always believe that we have more of a capacity to welcome than we're exercising. I think it's part of the grace, of our Catholic roots and of our understanding of the world, that our capacity to welcome rises to meet the challenge. And so we're seeing that in a lot of ways in Europe right now. And it doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean, that everything's figured out, but it's people really want to welcome. And so I think there's a part of me that could be discouraged of, well, what about people here? What about that? But I think I don't feel that discouragement so much. What I feel is an example and a hope of, well, if it can be done there, it can be done here. And it's because of political choices we're making. It's because we don't have, we're not being as courageous as we could be, or there can be lots of reasons and interpretations. But to me, it's yet another example of, if we're saying that we can't do this because it's not possible, that just doesn't seem true. If we're saying we can't do this because we don't want to, then that's a whole nother matter. But I think that we're being reminded in this moment of the possibility and strength of welcome. And if we can take a few lessons from that to push our own welcome, and one of our organization values is that radical hospitality. If we can grow in our radical hospitality, then it will be well placed here in this context. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if there's anyone that has questions. I will make my more formal teaser here. Let's see. Can you see my PowerPoint again? Okay, so these are my two advertisements now for ways that you could stay involved. Oh, and I promised to put something in the chat, so I'm going to just stop my share really quickly here and share with you two things. So in the chat, you're going to see a link to a YouTube page, which the YouTube page is where you could see this march, that's the Way of the Cross that's advertised on the left. So that'll be Monday again at 11 a.m. our time, which is 1 p.m. in Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's very confusing. Arizona doesn't do daylight time. But if you want to journey with us and see the live stream, it's that YouTube link that I sent you. And then the other invitation is this Catholic Sisters program that we have our first cohort coming next week, actually. That'll be coming in for this month-long experience. We have some reflections, we have advocacy trainings and other pieces in addition to them helping with the day in and day out of our migrant services. So we'll have probably another cohort in the fall, and then we'll probably do it 2 or 3 times in 2022, depending on how many applications arrive and which dates work for the sisters and which dates work for us. So the email address that I put in the chat, the volunteer@kinoborderinitiative.org, is the best place to contact us to ask about that opportunity. So hopefully you can be inspired by the strength of Sister Gracia and her spirit of fighting. Hopefully you'll continue to reflect on and think about Rolando and Antonia and Juana and some of the other people that I mentioned, about the choices that they're making to try to bring their kids a better life and find safety, lives, and livelihoods and know that we do have an extraordinary capacity to welcome.
Joanna, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm sure all of our viewers do as well. Just to hear about the reality at the border and all the men, women, and children that you and the Kino Border Initiative are helping in such powerful ways. Thank you too for sharing ways that we can become involved as well. Thanks to all of you who joined us, and have a wonderful evening.